paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
Entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Our guest today is psychiatrist Colin Ross. And how are you doing today, Colin?
I'm good, thank you.
And could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm an imposter, and nothing I say is true. Those are the main points. So I was born in Canada. Grew up there, went to medical school there, University of Alberta in Edmonton, back to Winnipeg where I grew up for my psychiatry training. I did 6 years as a hospital-based academic psychiatrist, moved to Texas in 1991 and have been living in Texas ever since. And my psychiatry focus is a combination of speaking, writing, research, clinical, and it's trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, dissociative disorders, and multiple mental health problems that go along with all of that.
You have the Colin Ross Institute, and right. you treat people with various, like PTSD, dissociative. What's the primary etiology of the trauma that you have to?
So it's complicated, complex, long-lasting childhood abuse. So physical abuse, verbal, sexual, domestic violence, really disturbed family dynamics, loss of caretakers through death, divorce, imprisonment, substance use. And this is just in North America, mostly inside the family. Then there's all kinds of cultural, social. If we go around the planet, there'd be war, famine, catastrophe, disaster. So there's no shortage of kids with PTSD and dissociation in Ukraine right now, for instance.
The human condition, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
What made you decide to go to Texas, where everything is big?
Well, there's a lot of empty space in Canada too. So in a way, it wasn't that huge a culture shock. So basically, this is 1991. I got an invitation to speak at a conference in the Dallas area, and it was put on by a hospital that was developing a program for dissociative disorders. And I was just invited down as a speaker. And then the program director, who was the conference organizer, and I just started talking. And, well, how much do psychiatrists earn down here? How many psychiatrists do you have? And literally in a 20-minute conversation, she goes, I'm talking to the CEO tomorrow. I ended up getting recruited. So it's by good karma, accident, luck.
Well, you were one of the first guys whose research I came across when I got into this very dark world of child trafficking about 20 years ago. And you had published a book called Bluebird, and you've since updated it. And you ultimately received, I think, 15,000 pages of documents from a FOIA request about the CIA mind control programs.
Right. So this was based on, so 91, I moved from Canada to the US and never heard about CIA military mind control, no interest in it. I wasn't even exactly sure what the Manchurian Candidate movie was. I thought it was set in China and that the star was Marlon Brando. I mean, it was completely out to lunch. And then shortly after arriving, patients started to tell me, not that I was used by my dad, my uncle, my brother, but I was taken onto a military base, or it was some sort of experimental lab somewhere, and there's doctors involved, and they did this and this and this and this. So of course I go, I don't know about that. And I decided to look into it. And a patient actually, with great paranoia and drama, handed me this little pile of papers, and I don't want these anymore. These are scaring me. And it turned out to be some MK Ultra documents. So then I basically started reading the small amount of literature there was. And then I ended up actually writing to the CIA, doing Freedom of Information Act request, and all these documents that have been declassified in the 70s. This is now 92, 93. I went down to a CIA reading room, looked through them all, and ordered them all, which back then was 10 cents a page. Now you can get it as a download for nothing. And I reviewed all these documents, and then basically went back to the library, back into the 50s and 60s, medical school library, got papers out, photocopied them, looked at the references, and did a whole search for all these authors and documenting that they were often top secret cleared CIA mind control contractors. So that's how I got into it.
Who were some of those doctors that you came across?
Well, they weren't just like obscure rascals in a basement somewhere. They were leading members of the profession, editors of journals, heads of major associations, well-known famous guys like Ewan Cameron in Montreal, who was head of the Quebec and Canadian Psychiatric Associations, the Society for Biological Psychiatry, I think, active in the World Psychiatric Association, was one of the group that interrogated prisoners on trial at Nuremberg and published in leading journals. Louis Jolyon West, who was chairman at the University of Oklahoma and later at UCLA. Martin Orne, one of the top handful of hypnosis experts in the 20th century. And then the list goes on from there.
And what kind of horrors did you uncover when you were looking into these guys?
Well, so point number one is this is the tiny tip of the iceberg that's been declassified, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just like the beginning of the story, not the depths of the ultimate horrors. But there's some stuff was just kind of ridiculous and crazy. So if you look at MK Ultra, which is one of the main projects, it had 149 sub-projects, and all of this being totally documented. About a third of those projects were just sort of acquisition projects, like ordering chemicals from a supply company and so on. Roughly about a third of them were no big deal, sort of typical academic research, funneled through front companies, which are called cutouts. So the almost always academic professors just thought they had got a grant from a foundation. And the purpose of that was to shed light on different topics and to get initial contact with these guys in case they wanted to give them clearance and recruit them in the future. And one of those was a project at the children's summer villages in Connecticut, I think it was. And it says in the documents, the purpose was to bring all these kids to the summer camp from many different countries. And then the contractor researcher, who didn't know it was CIA money, was studying how kids communicate when they don't have a common language. And then that just got published in a regular journal. So it's just normal academic research. But in the documents, it says the purpose of this was to form a relationship with young foreign nationals who might later be of interest to the agency. So it's like pre-recruiting spies, contractors from a whole bunch of different countries. But the research in and of itself was like just okay, bland. And then about a third of the contracts was people cleared at top secret for doing the more heavy duty stuff.
I first heard about Loretta Bender from you. Could you describe what she was up to?
Loretta Bender, a very revered person in the history of psychology, psychiatry, an obituary in the American Journal of Psychiatry, et cetera, and child psychiatrist. So before I got into this, I just thought, no, I didn't think much about her. I've heard of her. She's a famous person. And then I find out through her published papers, it's amazing that some of this stuff was published in regular journals. She gave LSD to kids as young as 5-6 years old, up to high school level, multiple times, and in some cases every day for 100+ days as some sort of supposed treatment. So first of all, that's psychiatry totally off the rails and crazy and out of its mind. But I wasn't able to establish concretely that she was herself a CIA or military contractor. But she's in a network of all kinds of different people, which is the way this whole thing works. It's this diffuse network of relationships and contacts. And she's pretty directly connected to other people who were Army, Air Force, CIA, LSD contractors. So she must have known about it.
She was funded through the Ecology Fund.
Human Ecology Foundation?
Yeah, I believe that's the case with her. I might be wrong.
I think that's not correct, but I'd have to check.
Okay.
But the documents, what I do remember is the documents don't establish that she was witting, which means you know it's CIA money. Unwitting means it's through the front organization you don't know. But she's so tightly connected in career academically to guys who definitely were contractors. It's not possible that she didn't know.
And the kids that she was megadosing were in New York City at Bellevue. That's where she was operating on. Many of those kids were lower socioeconomic kids that she was giving out.
Surprise. Yeah, so she wasn't doing the children of U.S. senators. Right.
I'm really glad that I was never sent to a child psychiatrist, especially her.
Yeah, no kidding. So that's part of the history. So it's sort of like the Tuskegee syphilis study. So again, the Tuskegee syphilis study wasn't done on sons and daughters of corporate executives. It was a bunch of poor, mostly illiterate Black workers in the southern United States who were followed for 40 years from the 30s to 1972 while being denied treatment for syphilis that the researchers knew that they had, just to see what happens when you don't get treatment for syphilis. And the whole lid was blown off it by a reporter in 1972. And then official medicine's all horrified and the thing gets shut down. But the results were published in mainstream medical journals. And so in 1965, there was a paper, Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro. And they had been following these guys for 30 years, like reporting on how many of them got sick, how many died. And it was funded by the US Public Health Service. The Surgeon General signed off on it and gave people certificates after 25 years. So this is what was in public, mainstream, not a conspiracy theory. So just imagine what's buried.
We have a lot of documentation on Ewan Cameron, who, because he did his thing, I'll let you explain, he did his thing to a parliament member of Canada. And he delivered his wife to his clinic because he was head of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, American Psychiatric Association, World Psychiatric Association. So he was supposed to be the best psychiatrist. And then when she came out, she didn't even know her name. So that was a class action suit. I think it was 10 lawsuits brought against the CIA. Could you talk a little bit about Cameron?
Sure. Well, so he was born in Bridge of Allan, Scotland, which is, I actually was very close to that on vacation a few years back. And then he moved to Canada. So one thing is, he's not in the United States, he's not at Harvard, he's not at Yale, he's tucked away there in Canada at McGill. And he did some pretty bizarre experiments back in the 30s, like exposing people with schizophrenia to red light for long periods of time, or putting them, like heating them up physically to see if that would help. And then he became head of all these different associations. As I said, he interviewed prisoners at Nuremberg, so very well-connected guy. And then he got money from the CIA to do de-patterning. So de-patterning is basically, and I have in my CIA doctor's book, which is the updated version of Blueberry, I have the medical records of this woman who was a patient of his with his signature in the records and so on, Linda McDonald. And she was a typical de-patterning person from May to September when she was in the hospital. She was admitted for kind of medium level depression, didn't even really need inpatient treatment. From May to September, she got 103 electric shock treatments. And in each of the treatment sessions, she got shocked 6 times instead of the standard 1 time. And it completely wiped out all memories from going into the Allen Memorial Institute back to birth, which when I interviewed her some decades later, she still couldn't remember any of that. And when she was discharged, she didn't know her name, where she was, didn't recognize her kids, didn't recognize her husband, couldn't play the guitar, didn't know how to cook. And she had to have a board in her kitchen and write down where her kids had gone to play so she could remember where they were. And it took quite a while to get her faculties back. She was a very psychologically well-balanced, charming person when I interviewed her. So the purpose, obviously, was to wipe out somebody's memories. Why the CIA would want to wipe out somebody's memories is not hard to figure out. But again, it was published in mainstream journals. And nobody was outraged. Nobody said boo. And then the other part was psychic driving, which is playing tape loops thousands of times over and over and over. So you wipe out somebody's personality, and then you give them instructions for "I love my mother." And most of it was recorded in their own voices. And so the idea is now they'll love their mother instead of hating their mother. So you'll redesign their personality. And while listening to these tape loops, they were often kept asleep for 20 plus hours a day with drugs for weeks on end. And then they were also dosed with LSD and hallucinogens. It was really, really like totally inhumane, unethical violation of human rights and medical ethics.
When I first bought your book, Bluebird, you had a excerpt from Subproject 136. And that talks about taking psychotics, children, and mediums and giving them electroshock, hypnosis, drugs, and whatever psychological tricks is. I don't know. That's and the experimenters will be particularly interested in dissociative states, including multiple personality, and an attempt to be made to induce a number of states of this kind. And did you ever dig into that subproject?
No, I didn't go any further on that one. So what I did was write a bullet. My office assistant went down to Colgate College in New York, where this guy, G.H. Estabrooks, was a professor for decades, and got all kinds of material from the archives and brought back photocopies of it all. And he corresponded back and forth with J. Edgar Hoover for 3 or 4 decades. He had like second, third in charge in the FBI people come to him, attend his workshops. He gave workshops on military bases. He corresponded with Jolly West and Martin Orne, who were cleared a top secret in the Manchurian Candidate program inside MKUltra. And so this is, again, this network of guys who are very in the know. And the whole purpose of it was creating Manchurian candidates. And G.H. Estabrooks described that in a textbook in the 40s and in writings all the way up to the early 70s. Very clear, not reading between the lines. He's using hypnosis and other techniques, creates a new personality that's hidden behind an amnesia barrier, inserts either codes or word phrases to bring out that other personality, assign them a task like a career assignment or infiltration assignment. In the one example, he's given a message. He goes back inside the newly created identity, goes on a military flight to Tokyo. The commander at the far end says this phrase, "The moon is clear." Out comes the secondary alter personality, delivers the message, response is inserted, back he goes. And so he was doing that on contract to the War Department in the Second World War. Totally based on documents, nothing about, somebody told me or a rumor. And he pitched this project to the CIA in the early 50s as well. So creating Manchurian candidates for operational use back at least as far as the Second World War is absolutely fact, not fiction. And G.H. Estabrooks like I'm just one guy. I don't have all these resources to follow up every lead. But he did do some sort of project of some kind in several orphanages in New York State. So he did some kind of work with children.
So I shudder to think what that could have been. Estabrooks, there was some finesse involved, whereas with Cameron, I mean, that was just completely brutal. And I always thought that Estabrooks was more advanced as far as knowing the mind than.
I agree. Yeah, he was.
And that quote I told you from Subproject 136, I included it in a book I wrote, and someone attacked me because they said that that subproject wasn't referring to multiple personality. And I mean, and that's exactly what it refers to, is creating multiple personalities. So
Right.
I guess you can't please everybody. And with I gave you the extreme abuse survey.
Yeah, I read that.
About it. What'd you think of the research?
So just for people who don't know, it's a survey of many different countries and many different respondents who speak many different languages. And it's basically ritual abuse, primary satanic ritual abuse, military mind control, asking all kinds of detailed questions about, have you ever had a client who described the following? And lots of people from all around the world. There's a lot of detail to all these questions describing, typical satanic ritual abuse with ceremonies and infant sacrifices, mind control programming, torture, and also mind control programming in a military context. So that's not proof that it's objectively real, but it does demonstrate that people are telling these stories all around the world in many different languages. And it's just the typical stuff that I've heard in therapy for decades.
Because there's Nixon supposedly banned mind control in 1973, but there's a subgroup within the extreme abuse survey that claimed to be mind controlled after 1973 as into the 80s. And I was wondering, have you come across that at your clinic where people think that believe that they've been mind controlled by the government?
Yeah, definitely. No, so this is a relatively small subgroup. It's not the majority of people. The majority of people with dissociative identity disorder equals multiple personality disorder, full form or maybe like 3/4 form. The majority, it's domestic abuse within the family, neighbors, sometimes some sex trafficking by the parents usually, and then a bunch of sexual trauma, in high school, college, first marriage, second marriage. It's only, I can't give you like a hard number, but since I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of people, it's a lot of people. I would say like under 10% describe, and possibly 5% or less describe. And this is of serious cases that end up in inpatient setting, describe either complex ritual abuse or CIA military mind control. So it's not anywhere near the majority, but it's also not like 1 in a million.
If you had to make an extrapolation, would you think that mind control was still being conducted after Nixon ended it in 1973?
I don't have to make an extrapolation. All I have to do is look at the photographs from Abu Ghraib and look at the public domain information that's known to politicians that there's been hearings about concerning Guantanamo Bay. And those enhanced interrogations is the word for it now. But enhanced interrogation is just a new term for mind control, coercive persuasion, brainwashing, thought reform. Those are all just different terms for the same thing. And in the Abu Ghraib photos and Guantanamo Bay photos, we know what happens. There's hooding, so people have sensory deprivation for prolonged periods of time. They have to sit in very painful positions for hours and hours and hours and hours. Sleep deprivation, electric shocks to their genitals and other parts of their body, sexual humiliation, humiliation of their religion, desecrating the Quran, mock attacks by dogs, being forced to men monkey around with each other sexually while a female U.S. soldier is watching. That's just what and waterboarding and so on. That's just what we know in the public domain. For sure, for a fact, has happened a whole lot. And those are just the classical techniques that were probably developed like thousands of years ago, but definitely were under development in Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra, and the other programs in the 50s and 60s. So this has not disappeared. It's systematic. It's run from top down. It's not just a few people who went off the reservation sort of thing. And then what happens is, it's a very interesting story, which maybe you could investigate. How did those photographs get out of Abu Ghraib? So that's like totally controlled, totally secure space. And we're supposed to think a couple of cowboy, cowgirl, low-ranking people went in there with cameras, took some photographs, snuck them out, took them over to the drugstore, got them developed, and then handed them over to. It's not a believable story. And if it is a true story, what kind of security is that?
It's, I guess, one of those enigmas that only history will be able to answer.
Right.
With dealing with dissociative identity disorder, a number of patients have been diagnosed with a number of various pathologies by the time they get to your institute. And
right.
What is it? Could you tell me about their odyssey? Someone with DID and what they have to go through to be just diagnosed properly?
Well, it's very varied. So, but I did one study, and Frank Putnam was a leading DID guy, did another study that we published in 1989, both of us, separate studies, where the average time in the mental health system before diagnosis of what then was multiple personality disorder was like 6.7 years. So commonly kicking around the mental health system, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, this, that, and the other diagnoses. And it just goes right by. So one project I did when I was in Canada was a review of usually one page, sometimes 2 pages consultation note, where psychiatry was consulted in the emergency department of the teaching hospital, and then either get admitted, don't get admitted. And they just never, which I already knew, that I documented, they would never ask about amnesia. It's just not a question. And one particular record, I remember that this guy came into the hospital, ER, describing different parts of himself by name and what they did, and asking to be admitted because he was suicidal. And they sent him home saying he's just a psychopath who was manipulating. So really obvious cases, just the questions don't get asked. It's not on people's minds. We've got 3 studies in the general population, 10 or 12 studies in general adult inpatients, 90-something studies in college students, where the average overall is about 1% of the population has DID, which includes a lot of mild cases, milder than we see clinically. About 10% some type of dissociative disorder. Psychiatric inpatients, about 15% a dissociative disorder, about 4% DID. So there's millions of people in the world going through the mental health system not getting recognized.
And what is the average age where someone finally gets diagnosed with DID?
Mid-20s to 40-ish. So that's what, because they're kicking around. They're either not coming for treatment or they're getting all kinds of different diagnoses and treatments and tons of meds that are not helping. And of course, if all these other treatments were helping, we would never see these people because they'd be out there and be okay.
And what type of therapeutic modalities do you use to begin the integration process with someone with dissociative identity disorder?
Well, it's kind of the more tools in the toolbox, the better. That's one of my models. But it's basically psychotherapy. there's no medication specifically for dissociation. If somebody's very depressed, antidepressant. If they're anxious, anti-anxiety med. But it's just general psychotherapy. So having a supportive relationship, somebody who takes you seriously, spends a lot of time with you, just trying to figure things out. So a lot of psychotherapy is very non-specific. It's just the support and the relationship. And then there's a cognitive therapy aspect to it. So different parts think it's 1982 or 1996. They're stuck in the past. They don't even cognitively know what year it is. They think they have separate bodies. So teaching them that that's not the case, getting them to look at their hands, their feet, look around, check things out. So now they're not stuck in the past, which makes all their PTSD worse. They're in the present. And then helping everybody decide to get to know each other, basically build a team and start brainstorming on how to function better in the world. And then there's a lot of more details to that. But so there's sort of like a family systems therapy, but it's on the inside. There's cognitive therapy, correcting beliefs like the abuse is my fault, I'm no good, I'm bad, I deserved it. And then there's a lot more detail to it, but that's the basic concept.
When I first started reading about dissociative identity disorder, which was formerly called multiple personality disorder, I think it was in the early 90s. And the goal there at that point was integration. And I think now it's putting together a working system where the parts talk to each other. Could you talk a little bit about that and which modality you think is the most successful?
Well, there's modality and outcome. So modality equals the tools you use. Integration is the outcome.
Yes.
And so integration means all blended back together into one person, which happens, which I know people who've done that. Then they're not hearing voices, they're not missing time, they're not having all this conflict inside. And they also, since they've done so much therapy, they don't have active eating disorders, they don't have active substance abuse, they're not suicidal. It's really an amazing thing to behold. And then there's all kinds of degrees along the way. So you can do no therapy, have no change, or you can get to the point where there's sort of everybody knows each other, they're cooperating together, things are working reasonably well. And then some people just elect to stop there. I don't want to be integrated. I don't want to lose all my friends. I'd be lonely. Or I just don't have the time and the energy for that. There's a million different reasons, which is fine. That's the person's choice. And as long as they're functioning okay, like, why do I care if they have people inside or not?
I've heard that one of the reasons why DID patients don't want full integration is because those alters that are very young, who took the abuse, they've grown very, very fond of them for taking all the abuse. And
yeah, that's true. So it's like I said, it's just, why would I lose all my friends and all my companions? And I've known them for years. But then the person who's saying that tends to be a person who doesn't have enough friends on the outside and is kind of lonely. Right. But still, as a way of coping, that's not bad.
So when someone comes to your clinic and they don't have a DID designation or a PTSD designation, how does that diagnosis start? How does it? What are the?
So they actually have DID, but they haven't been diagnosed.
But they haven't been diagnosed with it. Yeah.
It's actually quite straightforward. It's not this mysterious thing with different rules or some kind of secret intuition. There's just a whole series of questions that 98% of mental health professionals never ask. So it's kind of like, well, doctor, why do you never diagnose heart problems? Well, because I don't ask any questions about that. It's just not mysterious. Why don't you diagnose dissociative disorders? Because you don't ask any questions about it. Because you're not trained to. It's not on your radar, you think it's rare. So for full DID, there's a whole set of questions and they're standardized, paper and pencil tests and so on. Do you have any problem with your memory? So you start with a general open-ended question and then you narrow down, do you have periods of missing time? Then it's not just like I zoned out for 20 seconds driving my car. Could last minutes, hours, sometimes days. You're completely gone. You don't know what's happened with no drugs or alcohol involved. And do people tell you about what you've done during these periods of time? Do they describe you acting differently? Do you ever come out of one of these periods of missing time and you're somewhere and you don't know how you got there? Do people come up and call you by a different name or talk to you about stuff that you've done that you don't remember? They know you, but you don't know them. Do you find objects present that you can't account for? Not just, I found a pen, but like people will open the closet and there's a whole set of clothes that they don't remember buying. They're a couple of sizes too small, and they haven't worn clothes like that since they were a teenager. And then at the bottom of the closet, there's the bag and there's the receipt. And it's my credit card and slightly different looking signature. No, I never lost my credit card. Nobody else had it. And I'm missing 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. yesterday. So clearly a teenage part was out shopping for clothes. Regular people just don't have that ever. It's not like they have it a little bit. And then objects go missing. So I keep a journal every day. Been doing that for years. It disappeared. A couple of weeks later, I find it stuffed down in a cushion in the couch. I open it up and there's this angry handwriting I don't remember doing. So samples of different handwriting that you don't remember doing. And could be different styles of handwriting, and the handwriting could be addressing you or could be talking about you. She this, she that, she's an idiot. And then voices in your head talking to each other, talking to you, keeping up a conversation. And then a lot of people, if you just ask them, they can say, yeah, I have different people living inside and they sometimes take over and do stuff. They'll know that, but nobody's ever asked them about it. And it's important to remember, it's not literally separate people in there or separate personalities. It's fragmented parts of one person, but they experience it like separate people. So that, and then the trauma history. So on the diagnosis of DID, a couple of points. It's not a mysterious process with some strange questions. It's just standard mental health history taking, and most mental health professionals just don't ask those questions and don't have the mindset. And have been taught that it's rare or it's bogus or it'll be bad for your career if you diagnose that. And these symptoms go back in time before the diagnosis is made. And often, I mean, you don't, in just day-to-day clinical work, you don't always get a chance, but if you interview spouse, siblings, longtime friends, they'll often say, and the husband will say something like, sometimes my wife is just like a totally different person. And she doesn't even remember what we've just been talking about. And then I try and talk to her about that conversation later. And she says, never had that conversation. Why are you telling me that? Are you lying? Are you gaslighting me? And then sometimes, not most of the time, but sometimes they'll know alter personalities by name and have interacted with them before anybody ever made the diagnosis. So this idea that it's just cooked up, by some kind of whacked out group of therapists is not actually the case. Like any diagnosis, it can be overdiagnosed sometimes or misdiagnosed, but by far it's underdiagnosed compared to however much it's overdiagnosed.
You did some amazing research when it came to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation, for people that haven't heard about it, it was founded by someone who it was founded by 4 people, and one of them allegedly molested his daughter, and the other one was a theologian, and he said that pedophilia was God's will. So it kind of had a flimsy foundation, but it basically discounted dissociative identity disorder.
Right.
You did some amazing research looking into their advisory board or scientific board and looking at the backgrounds of the people that were behind the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Right. Well, the 2 main people who were behind it were the 2 parents who said that their daughter's incest memories, which she never went public on, didn't make any fuss about, were all completely false memories and created by therapy, which she clearly remembered them outside therapy. So they just, I give them sort of a little perverse credit. They didn't just, gossip to the ant. They formed this whole organization. They got all these academics on the board. They raised money. They held meetings. I mean, they were serious about discrediting their daughter, who's this is all public information, who's the editor of the Journal of Trauma and Dissociation, a very productive academic person, totally credible. And then they recruited all these guys and some gals to be basically their stamp of approval. And that included Mark Norm and Jolly West, who were cleared at top secret on the CIA's Manchurian candidate programs for the purpose of denying the reality of multiple personality that they themselves had been creating and investigating for the CIA and the military. And not by coincidence, this movement started when two things are going on. One is just regular civilian dads are getting sued by their daughters and they needed a defense. And then I think at the same time, there actually were dads who were falsely accused of incest. So there's multiple different factions joining this organization. But another thing that was going on is these ritual abuse and military mind control stories were coming out in therapy, almost all being told by people with multiple personality. So we better have a strategy to put a lid back on that. So there's just a bunch of academic researchers who thought that memory doesn't work that way. You don't block out big chunks of time. And then there was people who just hated Freud and thought it was all Freud's fault. So there's multiple factions came together, as in most social movements.
Martin Orn was he was kind of a bellwether there, who, as you said, had worked with making Manchurian candidates. He talked Frontline into doing a laudatory expose on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and the New Yorker wrote a laudatory piece on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. It was kind of amazing because all that you had to do, the person who allegedly molested his daughter, Peter Fried, he was interviewed by the Alternative Weekly in Philadelphia, and he was asked, how can you prove that you didn't molest your child? And I mean, the dude has a PhD in mathematics, right. But this is what he said: the dog didn't bark. I mean,
well, that pretty well proves that. There's a comical side to it, which is comical, but it's not funny stuff.
Yes,
and it was clearly well funded and well organized. It wasn't just a little community action program down the block.
Didn't you find a link between some of its financing and the government?
No, I didn't. I suspected it, but didn't find it.
Didn't find it.
Yeah.
You also wrote a book on ritual abuse.
Right.
What can you talk about that?
Well, so I had never, before I moved from Canada to the United States, late '91, never had somebody tell me a story of being in a satanic cult with sacrificing babies and all that stuff. I'd been hearing about it at meetings, and I was thinking, people are a little crazy down there in America because we don't have that in Canada. Well, lo and behold, if I'd stayed in Canada, I would have started hearing the same. So I come down to the United States and start hearing all these ritual abuse stories. And I didn't totally disbelieve it, but it was a little hard to believe. But then it was just more stories and more stories and more stories and more stories. I couldn't come to the conclusion that 100% of it was never happened. But what percentage and which person, I can't prove or disprove. But I started hearing like more and more and more and more of this stuff.
And go ahead.
And so then that was in '91. So I decided, and there's a big war about basically, is it real or not real? And the number one thing is you got to believe it or not believe it. And the non-believers attack the believers and accuse them of malpractice and hundreds of lawsuits and everything. So it was a very intense war going on. And in the meantime, zero people are writing about, okay, when somebody tells you these kind of stories, what do you do clinically? No guidelines, no helpful comments, nothing. Just this political, ideological war. And so I decided to write a book called Satanic Ritual Abuse, Principles of Treatment. And there's a lot of interesting things about that book. But the core theme was therapeutic neutrality. How to work with these people with a lot of details where you don't actively believe it and you don't actively disbelieve it. Because you can't prove that it did happen and you can never prove that it didn't happen. So it's really how to do therapy. That was the main point of it. And not I'm a believer and I'm fighting for the children or anything like that. So then that book got published in 95 because it's University of Toronto Press and goes through a whole academic process. And then either the next year, within a couple of years, there's 2 reviews of the book on Amazon, one right after the other. And the one reviewer is going, this Colin Ross is personally responsible for an epidemic of false memories and he's horrible and he's no good, which is the usual. And then the next review was, this Colin Ross is a horrible person because he doesn't believe the children. So literally the extremists on both ends would attack you if you didn't believe everything or if you believed anything. And that's where the False Memory Syndrome Foundation got into that fight and was trying to put a lid on the whole thing.
Well, I mean, according to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, there isn't even such a thing as dissociative identity disorder,
Right.
all because the dog didn't bark. With the extreme abuse survey, we talked about mind control, and there were a number of people that had answered those questions and said that they had been through mind control. But then there's a number of them that said that they had been through ritual abuse.
Right.
So how do you look at that?
Well, so that's not news to me. That's a survey. That's just a summary of my clinical experience for the last 30 years. I've met lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people who describe those kind of childhoods. And I also get a bunch of emails from people. This is a whole other separate issue, is targeted individuals, which is people who believe that they, the government or some group of nefarious people, are beaming electromagnetic weapons at them, harassing them, gang stalking them, doing this, that, and the other, which then gets blown off as they're just nuts and they're delusional. None of it's real, but actually those weapons do exist for a documented fact. They're easy. You just Google, you can find them online in minutes. And there's a long history going back through MKUltra and so on, which is all summarized in a report from hearings that Clinton set up back in the 90s. Long history of experimentation on unwitting civilians with biological weapons, LSD, radiation experiments. So the idea that the military and the government would experiment on civilians without them knowing it is absolutely documented and going on for decades, including things like in this Clinton hearing report, a guy named William Sweet, who's a pretty famous neurosurgeon at Harvard, who's tied into brain electrode experiments, which is a whole other topic. He's talking about plutonium experiments they did in Harvard hospitals. And he says that it was all ethical and we got consent from everybody. And then he himself describes HP7, which means human product 7, which is a patient who came into the ER who he injected with plutonium without knowing the person's name. The person was unconscious when they came in and they died without waking up. That's his version of informed consent. So crazy stuff that would never happen in a million years, totally documented at leading, if not the top medical school in the country. So back to the tip of the iceberg. All this stuff that all these people claim is not that far off of documented reality. And we just look at like organized middle class, upper class white people. They're going to sacrifice people in cults. Well, there was a cult called Nazi Germany. sacrificed a few people. So none of this is like out of the range of regular human behavior with doctors involved doing experiments. So I don't see, first of all, what's unbelievable about it. Can I prove that that's all been going on? No.
Actually, in your book, The CIA Doctors, you talk about Operation Paperclip, where a number of Nazi scientists were brought here. Not only Werner von Braun, who headed NASA, but some scientists that were involved in some pretty sordid things that actually had committed war. Well, Werner von Braun had committed war crimes too, but So I don't know if this is urban legend, but it's I've heard it surmised that they were kind of like Werner von Braun was kind of the nucleus of NASA, that these guys were kind of the nucleus of MK Ultra and the mind control. I don't know what that.
Well, so what we know for a fact, we know that top scientists from all kinds of different fields, including top doctors who did full-on atrocity experiments for the Nazis, were brought over to the United States under Project Paperclip and related projects because they had to be routed around the State Department because they couldn't get into the country on the grounds of being war criminals. So we just sort of brought them in this way. And it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scientists from all areas of science and engineering, including medical doctors. The only ones missing from the story are the psychiatrists. And we know that all kinds of psychiatric experiments were done in the death camps. So obviously, there's some buried information there. And again, it's not some wild conspiracy theory. This is all facts.
In your book, Bluebird and then CIA Doctors, you speculated about Sirhan Sirhan and Mark David Chapman, I believe, being self-induced Manchurian candidates. Do you still believe that? Or because some stuff has come out about Sirhan Sirhan about there was a psychologist named William Joseph Bryant. Actually, he was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and he was his thing was hypnosis. He was like the leading hypnosis expert in the United States. And there's some connection between him and Sirhan Sirhan. What do you have to think of? What do you think about that?
Well, I wouldn't mind interviewing Sirhan Sirhan, but if I did interview him, what I would find is he would still claim that he has amnesia for the shooting. And so he's either totally lying, he remembers, or he actually has amnesia. So if he's totally lying, well, that's not really interesting psychiatrically. If he has amnesia, it's not because he got a bump on the head. It's not something you would just normally forget. Well, I shot Bobby Kennedy, but I just kind of don't remember. It's obviously not normal forgetting. And so there's circumstantial evidence that he may have been handled by somebody. He went and studied hypnosis and related things with Rosicrucian manual at some point. He's maybe connected to this hypnosis expert, but it's all inconclusive. But he either kind of like self-hypnotized himself into not remembering, or somebody else worked on him. But the main point about Sirhan Sirhan is, this is according to the medical examiner who did the autopsy. The fatal shot was from a couple inches behind his ears from very close range. And you can obviously on YouTube just watch. So he's several feet in front of Bobby Kennedy. He cannot have made that shot. And there's in one of the books which is a very well-researched book, there's a photograph of the medical examiner measuring the entry holes in the door jambs, the walls, and adding those to the number of entry wounds in Kennedy and a couple of bystanders. It adds up to more than the chambers in the gun.
Yes.
It's completely physically impossible that he was the only shooter. So what did Los Angeles Police Department do with all that physical evidence?
They got rid of it.
Disposed of it after 9 months.
Yes.
what the heck? So there's only two possibilities there: incredible incompetence and stupidity, or a cover-up. Like, why are you going to dispose of all the evidence in one of the biggest murderers of the century? Nobody just does that for a filing error.
And somehow the authorities make statements like that, and Americans, I guess, either believe them or apathetic. I'm not sure.